The river doesn't hate you. Machiavelli's complete manual for living without illusions. Introduction. The letter from the mud. Here is the thing no one tells you about Machiavelli. He was not a villain. He was not the cold architect of manipulation that 5 centuries of bad reputation have constructed him to be. He was a man who had been tortured, literally suspended by bound wrists until his shoulders dislocated, dropped 6 times, released only because there was nothing to confess, and who sat down afterward, on a failing farm, in borrowed silence, and wrote the clearest account of how life actually operates that the Western world has ever produced. And almost no one has read it correctly. The man who fully accepts that life is not fair is the only one capable of building a life that lasts. I know how that sounds. I know what part of you wants to argue with it right now. Don't. Not yet. Hold it in the ear the way you hold a note before you decide whether it resolves. Because by the time this book ends, that sentence will not sound like cynicism. It will sound like the most liberating thing anyone has ever honestly said to you. But before the philosophy, there is a man, and the man is where everything begins. December 10th, 1513. The village of Sant'Andrea in Percasina, 10 kilometers south of Florence. A 44-year-old man wakes before light in a farmhouse that smells of damp stone and old wood and the specific exhaustion of a life that has been taken apart and not yet put back together. His name is Niccolò Machiavelli, and 14 months ago, he was the secretary of the Florentine Republic, a diplomat who negotiated with kings, commanded militias, and sat across from the most dangerous men in Italy and looked them steadily in the eye. Then the Medici returned to power. He was accused of conspiracy, arrested, subjected to the strappado, a form of torture in which the body is suspended by bound wrists tied behind the back until the shoulders dislocate. He was dropped 6 times. He did not confess because there was nothing to confess. They released him without apology, stripped him of his title, his income, and his relevance, and sent him here, to this farm, to this smell, to the specific indignity of arguing with firewood merchants over pennies. He is in debt. His shoulders carry the memory of dislocation. The mornings are small and humiliating, and he does not pretend otherwise. In the morning, he manages what little remains of the property. In the afternoon, he walks to the local tavern and gambles with the butcher and the miller, shouting over card games, ordinary, invisible, entirely beneath the man he used to be. He describes all of this in a letter to his only remaining friend with the kind of deadpan precision that tells you he knows exactly how far he has fallen and has chosen, with full awareness, not to flinch from it. But then evening comes. And this is where the letter stops being autobiography and becomes something else entirely. He writes, "On the coming of evening, I return to my house and enter my study. And at the door, I take off the day's clothing, covered with mud and dust, and put on garments regal and courtly, and reclothed appropriately. I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them with affection, I feed on that food which only is mine and which I was born for." Hear that again. A man who has lost everything, who spent the afternoon losing card games to a butcher, who wears the mud of a failing farm on his body every single day, and every evening, without audience, without applause, without any evidence that it will ever matter, he dresses for the encounter. He puts on the regal robes. He treats the conversation with dead philosophers as the most important meeting of his day. In that room, in that ritual, stripped of wealth and status and the attention of the world, he wrote The Prince. He wrote the discourses on Livy. He built, in the silence of his exile, the most influential body of political thought that Western civilization has ever produced. His enemies are dust. His torturers are forgotten entirely. And here you are, 5 centuries later, receiving the manual they tried to bury, already feeling something shift in the chest before we have formally begun. That shift has a name. We will come back to it. Here is what this book is not. It is not a guide to manipulation. It is not an invitation to become cold or to treat people as instruments or to win at the expense of your own humanity. If that is what you came for, you will be disappointed, and you will have made the same error that every careless reader of Machiavelli has made for 500 years. What this is a correction. A long overdue correction to the gap between what the evidence of human behavior actually shows, what history actually records, what 5 centuries of lived experience actually demonstrates, and what most people are ever genuinely told about the nature of the world they are living in. Most people are operating on a story where loyalty is reliably returned, where effort is recognized in proportion to its quality, where the universe maintains some ambient sense of justice that will eventually balance the ledger. Machiavelli watched that story consume brilliant people, good people, people with every advantage and genuine intention, and it consumed them not because they were weak, but because they were operating on a map that did not match the territory. This book is the territory. There are 5 concepts you will come to know before we are done, not as vocabulary to memorize, as tools to carry. You will hear them now and watch them deepen over the following chapters until they feel less like ideas and more like old, reliable instruments in a drawer you now know how to use. Virtue, not virtue in the moral sense. Effective force, the precise, disciplined combination of skill, courage, decisiveness, and strategic intelligence that allows a person to shape circumstances rather than simply be shaped by them. Machiavelli's highest compliment, the quality he spent his entire life studying in others and forging, slowly, painfully, in himself. Fortuna, the flood, the half of life that no amount of discipline or brilliance will ever control. The illness, the betrayal, the economic collapse arriving from the direction you weren't watching. Machiavelli compared her to a violent river. She is not your enemy. She is simply indifferent. And indifference at scale is more devastating than any enemy you could name, because at least an enemy has a reason. Necessity, the great sculptor of character, the force that strips away every comfortable option until only the essential ones remain. Machiavelli did not believe necessity was punishment. He believed it was the only reliable forge of anything real. He was living proof. The cycle, the iron rhythm that governs all human systems without exception. Strength produces order. Order produces prosperity. Prosperity produces comfort. Comfort produces weakness. Weakness invites collapse. Machiavelli documented it in Rome, in Florence, in every republic he ever studied. You are living somewhere inside it right now, whether you know it or not. The surface and the depth, the gap, or the absence of a gap, between what you project to the world and what you actually are. This is Machiavelli's most misread insight and, in practice, his most useful one. For most people, there is a gap, and the energy required to maintain it is quietly consuming their entire lives. Here is what this book will ask of you. Not much on the surface. You do not need a notebook. You do not need a system or a subscription or a morning routine. What it will ask is harder than all of that. It will ask you to sit with the genuine possibility that some of the most foundational beliefs you hold about fairness, about loyalty, about what you are owed for the effort you have put in, are not wrong because you are foolish. They are wrong because no one who truly understood the alternative ever found a comfortable way to tell you. It will ask you to look at the people in your life, the systems you operate inside, and the stories you tell yourself about your own potential, not with bitterness, not with cynicism, but with the specific, clear-eyed precision of someone who has finally decided that accurate perception is an act of love toward yourself. And it will ask you to consider that the man in the farmhouse, broke, humiliated, in pain, forgotten, with no evidence that any of it would ever matter, who dressed himself in regal robes every single evening and wrote for an audience that would not exist for another 5 years, was not enduring his life. He was building something the world could not ignore. That is the invitation. That is what we are doing here. Before the first chapter begins, find a quiet moment. Think of one time you were told, directly or indirectly, that the world operated fairly. That good work would be noticed. That loyalty would be returned. That effort, reliably applied, would produce what it deserved. Hold that moment. Feel where it lives. Then sit with this question, not to answer it, but to hold it. What have you avoided attempting because you believe the world owed you a more reliable promise than it has ever actually made? Don't answer. Just hold it there. That is the room we are walking into together. Chapter 1. Gravity has no opinion of you. There is a study that should have changed how we teach children about friendship. It didn't, but it should have. In the early 1990s, researchers examining the mechanics of human cooperation gave a group of adults a simple task. They were asked to predict, in situations of genuine personal cost, lost money, lost status, lost comfort, how often the people closest to them would choose to help rather than protect themselves. The participants were confident. Their predictions were warm. The actual results, when real cost was applied to real relationships, were not. Not because the participants were surrounded by bad people. Because the researchers had introduced something no one had accounted for. Pressure. And pressure, it turns out, has a way of making visible what comfort was quietly concealing all along. Machiavelli would not have been surprised. He had run this experiment on a far larger scale, not in a laboratory, but across the entire arc of 15th century Italian political history, and arrived at the same conclusion 500 years earlier. He wrote it plainly, without softening it for an audience that might flinch. All men will act correctly when it costs them nothing. Change the cost, and you will see what was real. Most people hear that and flinch immediately. It sounds like the voice of someone who has been hurt too many times and decided to call their wounds wisdom. But here is the distinction that Machiavelli was actually making, and that almost every popular reading of him destroys in the first paragraph. It is not a statement about human badness. It is a statement about human structure. And the difference between those two readings is the difference between a life spent in resentment and a life spent in functional clarity. Consider gravity. You understand gravity. You don't resent it. You don't feel betrayed when an object falls. You don't take it personally when the ground declines to accommodate your preference for remaining upright after you've lost your footing. Gravity is a force. It operates. It has no position on your well-being. It simply functions, with total consistency, at all times, in all conditions, without exception or apology. Now consider self-interest. Evolutionary biology has spent several decades producing a body of evidence that Machiavelli arrived at through pure observation. And that evidence says this: the human nervous system is, at its core, a survival instrument. It was not designed by evolution, by selection pressure, by the long, brutal logic of species continuity, to prioritize your comfort over its hosts. The brain that kept your ancestors alive was the brain that evaluated every social interaction through a single persistent question: does this serve me, or does it cost me? This is not a flaw. It is the engine. It is the reason you are here at all, and the reason everyone around you is here. The bloodline that survived was the one that, under sufficient pressure, chose itself. Robert Trivers, the evolutionary biologist, called this reciprocal altruism, the observation that human cooperation is fundamentally conditional. We cooperate when the expected returns justify the investment. We withdraw when they don't. And we are extraordinarily skilled at constructing narratives, to ourselves and to others, that make the withdrawal look like something more noble, something with better lighting. Machiavelli had no access to evolutionary biology. He had something better. He had Florence. The year is 1494. You are standing in the Piazza della Signoria, and the city you have known your entire life is unraveling in real time. For 60 years, the Medici held Florence together through a specific and masterful combination of cultural patronage, financial manipulation, and carefully maintained appearances. They funded the art. They managed the debt. They kept the peace by keeping everyone either dependent or dazzled, often both simultaneously. And for 60 years, the citizens of Florence praised them, wove the Medici name into the civic story of what Florence was and what Florence meant. Then Charles VIII of France arrived with 30,000 soldiers. Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, the man who inherited the machinery without inheriting the genius, rode out to meet him and, in a single afternoon, surrendered Florentine fortresses to the French without consulting anyone, without a fight, to save his own skin. He returned to Florence. The citizens who had praised his family for 6 decades turned on him within hours. The palace was looted. The art that had been publicly celebrated as Florence's cultural soul was stripped and taken. The family was exiled. And within days, almost no one remembered the festivals, the patronage, the decades of relative stability the Medici had genuinely provided. The machine of self-interest activated, and 60 years of performed loyalty evaporated like morning fog. Machiavelli was 25 years old. He stood in that city and watched it happen. He never forgot it. The lesson he extracted was not that Florentines were uniquely fickle or that the Medici had been uniquely naive. The lesson was structural. The loyalty had always been conditional. The conditions changed. The loyalty revealed itself for what it had always actually been, not a commitment, but a calculation running invisibly in the background the entire time, biding its moment. He wrote, years later, with the economy of a man who has watched the same pattern repeat across generations. Everyone is loyal to the conditions that make loyalty comfortable. 6 words. 25 years of watching power operate in the most sophisticated political environment in the Western world, compressed into 6 words. Now here is the question I want you to sit with, as a scientist rather than as someone whose feelings are involved. If loyalty is structurally conditional rather than absolute, what does that tell you about the relationships in your own life that you have been treating as unconditional? Not to frighten you, to sharpen you. Because here is what Machiavelli actually prescribed, and it is nothing like the cold manipulation his reputation suggests. He said, understand the architecture. Build accordingly. Trust is not a feeling, he argued. It is a structure. And like any structure, it requires maintenance, honest inspection, and the clear-eyed admission that no material lasts forever under unlimited stress. The engineer who builds a bridge does not do so on the assumption that gravity will occasionally take a day off. She builds the bridge to hold weight, real weight, anticipated weight, unexpected weight. She accounts for the force rather than hoping the force won't apply. This is not pessimism. This is the specific competence of someone who intends to build something that lasts. Set that alongside what most people actually do. Most people build their relational lives, their professional identities, their financial security on the assumption that the people around them will behave at their best under conditions that have never actually been tested. They extend trust not as a calculated structure, but as a feeling, warm, generous, and entirely unexamined. And then when the conditions change, when the pressure arrives, when the cost of loyalty suddenly exceeds the comfort of it, they experience what they call betrayal. Machiavelli would call it data. Painful, expensive, irreplaceable data about how a particular structure performs under real load. He would also say, you had the option to find this out before it cost you everything. You chose not to, because finding out required asking questions that felt disloyal to ask. That unwillingness to test the hypothesis, because testing it felt like a violation of the feeling, is what built the trap. Not the other person's nature. Their nature was always going to be their nature. Your refusal to account for it is what left you exposed. Here is where Machiavelli's thinking diverges sharply from every motivational framework you have ever encountered. He did not believe in unlimited potential. He did not believe you could become anything you wanted if you wanted it badly enough. He believed something far more dangerous and far more useful than that. He believed that life is a war between 2 forces, and your fate depends entirely on which one you feed. The first force is fortuna, not luck in the lottery sense. Fortuna is the flooding river, the half of life that no amount of discipline, planning, or brilliance will ever reach. The illness that arrives in a healthy year. The economic collapse that wipes out a decade of careful work. The betrayal you didn't see coming from the person you would have staked everything on. The opportunity that arrives 10 years after you needed it. Fortuna is violent, indifferent, and utterly ungovernable. Machiavelli did not flinch from this. He argued she governs roughly half of all human affairs. Half. That means half your outcomes, the results, the endings, the actual shape of what happens to you, are decided by forces your effort cannot reach. I want you to sit in that without immediately arguing your way out of it. Because the temptation is to produce counterexamples, the stories where individual effort bent circumstance. Those stories exist, but for every one of them, there are 10,000 equally effortful lives that met circumstances which simply did not yield. Those stories don't get told because they don't serve the narrative anyone wants to purchase. Machiavelli was not interested in a narrative. He was interested in what was actually operating. The second force is virtue, effective force, the disciplined, courageous, strategically intelligent capacity to act with full power on the half of life that is actually available to you. Virtue is the embankment you build before the river rises. It is the internal architecture that remains when everything external has been stripped away, and from which, if you have built it well, you can reconstruct. Machiavelli's own life was the argument. Tortured, exiled, reduced to penny arguments with firewood merchants. And every evening, without audience, the regal robes, the conversation with the ancients, the construction of something the world had not yet decided to receive. That was virtue, not performance, not resilience as a brand. The real thing, the capacity to act with full force on the controllable half, so that when Fortuna moves, as she always moves, you are not standing in the open with nothing. Most people waste their virtue, their actual available capacity for meaningful action, on things that do not compound, on arguments that change nothing, on relationships that have been functionally over for years, on careers chosen to satisfy someone else's idea of who they should be, on the endless maintenance of a self-image that requires constant defending because the substance beneath it is thin. And then Fortuna arrives. The flood comes, and they have no embankments, no reserves, no internal structure built for exactly this. They stand in the open and beg the river to be kind. The river does not do kind. The river does what rivers do. Machiavelli's instruction, stripped of 5 centuries of misreading, is not to become hard, not to stop trusting or loving or building with other people. It is this: aim your virtue at things that compound. Build the embankments before you hear the water rising. Understand the architecture of human self-interest, not to exploit it, but to account for it, the way the engineer accounts for gravity, and build structures that actually hold. And know, with the specific, quiet clarity of someone who has looked at this without flinching, that the loyalty being offered to you right now by the people around you is real. It is genuine. It is also conditional on conditions that have not yet been fully tested. That is not a tragedy. That is the nature of the material. Work with the material. Love the material. But do not build a life on the assumption that the material is something other than what it is. Pause here if you can, eyes closed if it is safe to do so. Think of one relationship you treasure, someone whose loyalty you have never seriously questioned. Now, gently, without judgment, ask, what are the conditions that make this person's loyalty comfortable for them right now? What do you provide that makes alignment with you the path of least resistance? Don't conclude anything from the answer. Just notice it. Notice whether seeing a relationship you love as a structure makes it feel less real, or, surprisingly, more. The engineer who understands exactly how the load is distributed does not love the bridge less for understanding it. She loves it more. She knows what it can hold. She knows what it was built for. Carry that with you, because the next chapter introduces a man who understood this principle so completely, so physically, so practically, that he made himself Duke of Milan from nothing. His hands tell the whole story. Chapter 2. Francesco Sforza's hands. He is 23 years old, and he is standing in a field that is not his, holding a weapon he was not born into, wearing armor that still carries another man's dents. He has no title, no inheritance, no noble blood that anyone would recognize. His father, Muzio Attendolo, was a peasant farmer from Romagna who picked up a sword one afternoon and never put it down, who fought his way into the mercenary trade through sheer, relentless physical force and earned the nickname Sforza, meaning strength, thrust, compulsion. It was not a family name. It was a reputation that became one. This son, this Francesco, has been watching how the world operates since he was old enough to watch. And what he has seen is this. Power in 15th century Italy does not belong to the most virtuous or the most deserving or the most beloved. It belongs to the person who is standing in the right place at the exact moment the ground shifts. And it stays with the person who, having taken it, never gives anyone a clean reason to take it back. He has no illusions about fairness. He never did. In this, he was Machiavelli's favorite example of a man who actually understood the game he was playing. Here is what most people do when they're trying to build something from nothing. They announce it. They tell people about the plan. They describe the future version of themselves in present tense, the business, the position, the life they are constructing, as though the declaration itself is a form of progress. And in doing so, they release the pressure that should have been driving them. The brain, neurologically, partially satisfies the desire through the telling of it. The applause arrives before the work. And without the internal pressure, the work tends not to follow. Machiavelli understood this instinctively. He wrote that the most dangerous man in any room is the one who listens, watches, and says nothing. Not because silence is a strategy in itself, but because silence is what happens when a person is so focused on the actual construction that there is simply nothing left over for performance. Francesco Sforza was that man. Decades before he held any formal power, he was studying, watching which alliances held under pressure and which dissolved the moment the conditions changed, watching which commanders inspired genuine loyalty and which commanded through fear alone, and noticing, with surgical precision, the difference in how those men died. Building relationships not as social gestures, but as structural investments. Saying less than he knew, revealing less than he felt. Not because he was cold, because he was building something that required the element of surprise to survive. The discipline of silence is not the absence of a voice. It is the presence of control. When you speak, you spend. When you listen, you collect. Sforza spent decades collecting. In 1412, Muzio Attendolo, the father, drowned crossing the Pescara River. The mercenary company he commanded, the men, the contracts, the reputation built across a lifetime of warfare, all of it now technically leaderless. Francesco was 21. He could have stepped back. He could have let an older, more established condottiere absorb the company, taken a lesser position, survived with less risk, lived a smaller life with a greater guarantee of living it. This is what most people would have done. This is what the situation, on its surface, seemed to demand. He stepped forward instead. Not through a speech, not through a declaration, through the specific, physical, unambiguous act of taking command and demonstrating, in the field, in front of men who would test him, that the capability was real, that the authority was not inherited or assumed, but earned in the only currency that mercenary soldiers accepted, results they could see with their own eyes and trust with their own lives. He fought. He won. He lost occasionally, but always extracted himself in ways that cost him less than they cost his enemies. He made alliances strategically and broke them, when necessary, with a precision that minimized enemies made. He watched Fortuna move, the shifting political currents of Milan, Naples, Venice, the Papal States, with the patience of a man who understood that you do not force a river. You study it until you know exactly where it intends to go, and then you build your embankment there first. This is virtue in its most physical form, not courage as a feeling, courage as a discipline. The repeated, deliberate choice to act with full force in the half of life that is actually available, even when, especially when, the outcome is not guaranteed. But here is the part of Sforza's story that Machiavelli found most instructive, and it is the part most people skip. For years, Sforza served Filippo Maria Visconti, the Duke of Milan, a paranoid, physically repulsive, extraordinarily capable ruler who trusted almost no one and controlled everyone around him through a masterful combination of reward and fear. He gave Sforza command of his armies. He gave Sforza his illegitimate daughter, Bianca Maria, in marriage, a gesture that meant something real in the political architecture of the time. He made Sforza, effectively, the most powerful military figure in northern Italy. And all the while, Sforza watched, not with resentment, not with impatience, with the specific, disciplined attention of a man who knows that the current situation is temporary and that the quality of his observation now will determine the quality of his position later. Filippo Maria died in 1447 without a male heir. Milan declared itself a republic, the Ambrosian Republic, and the political ground that had been stable for decades became, overnight, a churning chaos of competing claims, foreign invasion, internal faction, and the particular desperation of a city that has lost its center of gravity and cannot agree on where to find a new one. Fortuna had moved, and Sforza was ready. Not because he had been lucky, not because the timing was a gift, because he had spent 20 years building the embankments precisely at the point where he understood the river would eventually break. He had the military capability. He had the alliances. He had the marriage connection to the previous dynasty. He had the reputation, earned in blood, not borrowed from a name, that made soldiers willing to follow him and cities willing to negotiate with him. In 1450, after 3 years of maneuvering through the chaos with the patience of someone who understands that premature action is the most common way talented people destroy themselves, Francesco Sforza entered Milan as its duke. A peasant's son, no noble blood, no inheritance, no title that anyone gave him. Power that was built does not need to beg for legitimacy. It arrives already carrying its own. Machiavelli wrote about Sforza and the prince with something that reads, in the original Italian, almost like admiration. He contrasted him directly against those who inherit their positions, who are gifted power by circumstance rather than constructing it through action. And the pattern he documented across generations of Italian history is this: power that is given is always taken back. Power that is built endures. Because power that is given arrives without the person understanding what it costs to create it, without the specific, embodied knowledge of what holds it in place and what erodes it, without the instincts that only develop through the actual experience of earning something under conditions that could have gone the other way. The inherited ruler treats power like a possession. The built ruler treats it like a living structure that requires constant maintenance, honest inspection, and the ongoing willingness to do what is necessary rather than what is comfortable. You can hear the parallel to your own life without my drawing it explicitly. Now here is where Transcript 2's insight lands with real force, the interior dimension of everything Sforza built externally. The discipline that produced a Duke of Milan was not primarily physical. It was emotional. Sforza could not afford to be predictable, not to his enemies, that is obvious, but more importantly, not to his own impulses. Because a man whose actions are determined by how he feels in a given moment is a man who can be defeated simply by engineering the right moment. Make him angry, make him desperate, make him afraid, and watch him do exactly what you needed him to do, on your schedule, at your convenience. The disciplined man, the Machiavellian man, in the precise sense of that term, has detached his output from his internal state. He feels everything: the desire to react, to retaliate, to collapse, to quit. He feels the sting of insult and the weight of fatigue and the seductive logic of the easier path. The difference is not that he doesn't feel these things. The difference is that he does not consult them before he acts. Machiavelli described this in terms of the prince and his subjects. You are the prince. Your emotions are the subjects. You listen to them. They carry information. They tell you things worth knowing, but you do not allow them to govern the kingdom. When they riot, you restore order, not through suppression, but through the specific, practiced authority of a self that has decided, in advance and without negotiation, what it is going to do. This is what Sforza understood in his bones: the 3-second decision that bypasses the negotiation, the movement that precedes the doubt. Not recklessness, the opposite of recklessness. The disciplined refusal to allow the brain's comfort-seeking, loss-averse, worst-case imagining machinery to veto the action that the situation actually requires. Your brain was not designed for greatness. It was designed for survival, which in evolutionary terms meant conserving energy, avoiding risk, and staying close to the herd. It is a magnificent instrument for the conditions that produced it. Those conditions were not 15th century Milan. They were not whatever you are trying to build right now either. The work is to become the kind of person who can override the survival circuit without losing the intelligence it carries. To feel the fear and move anyway, not because you are reckless, but because you have decided, in advance, that the construction matters more than the comfort. Sforza died in 1466, Duke of Milan, 65 years old. The city he entered as a conqueror, he left as an institution. The dynasty he founded lasted another century. He never stopped building. He never reached a point where the embankments seemed sufficient and the vigilance could relax. Because he understood, the way Machiavelli understood, the way everyone who has looked at history without wishful thinking understands, that the moment you believe you have arrived is the moment the ground begins to shift beneath you. The cycle does not pause for the deserving. It does not award exemptions for accumulated virtue. It moves. And the only question it asks of you is whether you have been paying attention or whether you have been coasting on what yesterday built. We will spend real time with the cycle, because it is the most unsettling and most useful thing Machiavelli ever documented. And before we can talk about what to do about it, you need to fully understand what it actually is, not as historical theory, but as the living pattern currently operating in your own life, right now, in the areas where you are most comfortable. Comfort is where the rot begins. But first, there is a misreading of Machiavelli that has done more damage than any other. A misreading so widespread that it has caused generations of people to dismiss the most useful philosophical framework ever constructed for navigating actual human reality. We need to clear it. We need to do it precisely. Because the next time someone tells you that Machiavelli was just advising you to lie, you will know exactly what they missed and why it cost them. Close your eyes for a moment if you can. Think of something you are currently building, a relationship, a career, a version of yourself, anything. Now ask honestly, are you building it in the open, seeking validation for effort not yet made? Or are you building it in the dark, letting the work accumulate until the results speak in a voice louder than anything you could say? Notice the difference in how those two approaches feel in the body. One is warm, social, immediately rewarding. The other is colder, lonelier, and it compounds in a way the first one never will. Sforza built in the dark for 20 years. The Duke of Milan was already there. It just hadn't been named yet. What are you building that hasn't been named yet? Carry that into the next chapter. Because the man who advises you to lie is about to be corrected, and the correction changes everything. Chapter 3. He was not advising you to lie. Let's say the common belief out loud, plainly, without mockery, because it deserves that much respect before we dismantle it. Machiavelli was a cynical manipulator who believed the ends always justify the means. He taught rulers to deceive, to break promises when convenient, to use people as instruments, and to wear virtue as a costume while harboring none of it beneath. He is, in short, the philosophical godfather of every corrupt politician, every backstabbing executive, every person who has ever smiled at you while working against you. That is the reading. It has lasted 5 centuries. It is repeated by people who have never opened the prints and occasionally by people who have. And it is wrong, not partially wrong, not wrong in a few details, structurally, fundamentally wrong in a way that has caused enormous damage to the people who accepted it, because it caused them to reject the most accurate map of human social reality ever drawn. Here is what Machiavelli actually wrote. And more importantly, here is what he actually meant. Chapter 18 of The Prince. One of the most quoted and most misread passages in the history of political philosophy. He writes, "Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. And those few dare not oppose the opinion of the many." Most people read that as a license to deceive. A green light for the gap between performance and reality. An endorsement of the mask. It is none of those things. It is a description. a precise, unsentimental description of how human social reality actually operates, regardless of whether you like it, regardless of whether it should operate differently, regardless of your entirely reasonable preference that people would judge you by your interior qualities rather than your surface signals. Machiavelli is not advising you to create a false surface. He is telling you, with the patient specificity of someone who has watched this play out across decades of political observation, that the surface is what the world reads first and often only, and that if you ignore this, the world will not adjust to compensate for your preference. The question is not whether to have a surface. You already have one. Everyone does. The question is whether your surface accurately represents what is beneath it, and whether you are conscious of the signals you are already sending, whether you intend to or not. Now, Agathocles of Syracuse. Machiavelli discusses him in Chapter 8 of The Prince, and the analysis is, as he would say, bone cold. Agathocles was a potter's son, like Sforza, no noble blood, no inheritance, no advantage of birth. He rose through the ranks of the Syracusan military through a combination of genuine capability and ruthless ambition. And then, when the opportunity presented itself, he summoned the leading citizens and senators of Syracuse to a meeting and had them all killed. Every potential rival, eliminated in a morning. He seized power. He held it for decades. By any external measure, he succeeded. And Machiavelli says, and this is the sentence that contains the entire lesson, his victories cannot be attributed to virtue. Why not? He won. He held power. He survived. What is missing? What is missing is this. Agathocles won every battle, but could never sleep without a guard at his door. He ruled, but could never govern. He held the position, but had destroyed the fabric of trust that makes any position sustainable over time. The means he used to get there required him to spend the rest of his life defending against the same means being used against him. He ruled in a permanent state of siege, not from external enemies, from the internal logic of how he had arrived. Machiavelli's verdict is precise. You can lie, manipulate, and brutalize your way to the top, but you will spend the rest of your life maintaining the lie. The energy cost of sustained deception is catastrophic. Eventually, the mask fuses to the face, and you lose track of which one is real. This is not a moral argument. It is an engineering argument. Deception as a primary strategy is structurally inefficient. It requires constant maintenance. It scales poorly, and it produces a specific, irreversible kind of isolation, the loneliness of a person who cannot be known, because being known would destroy them. So what was Machiavelli actually advising? He was advising adaptability, and he was advising it in the context of a world, not unlike yours, where rigidity is consistently punished. He wrote that a prince must appear merciful, faithful, humane, sincere, and religious, and must actually be so when possible. Note that last phrase, when possible, not as an aspiration, as a default. Start from genuine, operate from genuine, build from genuine. But when the situation demands otherwise, when the circumstances require a response that genuine warmth or consistent kindness cannot produce, he must be able to shift without being paralyzed by a self-concept that cannot accommodate the shift. This is the distinction that the misreading collapses. There is an enormous difference between a person who performs virtue while harboring none, who wears the mask as a weapon from the beginning, whose surface is a lie calculated to extract advantage, and a person who is genuinely capable, genuinely trustworthy, genuinely present in the world, but who understands that the world reads surfaces first, and who therefore ensures their surface accurately represents the depth beneath it, and who can adapt that surface to circumstance without losing the substance that anchors it. The first person is Agathocles. The second is what Machiavelli was describing as the actual goal. Here is where the third transcript's most useful concept enters, and it enters here because this is exactly where it belongs. Transcript 3 introduces what it calls the law of the persona, and it makes a claim that most people find uncomfortable on first encounter. You are not one person. You are a multiplicity. You are different with your mother than you are with your boss, Different with your closest friend than with a stranger you need something from. Different in the room where you feel safe than in the room where you feel tested. Most people experience this multiplicity as a kind of inauthenticity, a failure to be a unified self. They have been taught that the ideal is consistency, the same person in every context, transparent, readable, what you see is what you get. And any deviation from that feels like dishonesty. Machiavelli would call this a category error. Authenticity is not the same as uniformity. A hammer and a scalpel are both genuine tools. They are not interchangeable. The surgeon who tries to operate with a hammer in the name of authenticity is not more honest than one who uses the right instrument for the job. She is just less effective, and her patient suffers for it. The conscious curation of how you show up in different contexts is not deception. It is calibration. It is the recognition that different situations have different requirements, and that a person who cannot adjust their register, their tone, their approach, their face, is a person who will be consistently outmaneuvered by people who can. The lion and the fox. Machiavelli's most famous image for this. The prince must know how to be both, ferocious when ferocity is required, cunning when cunning is required. If you are only the lion, you walk into traps. If you are only the fox, the wolves eat you. The capacity to be both is not hypocrisy. It is fluidity. It is survival. But here is the limit, and Machiavelli understood this limit clearly, which is why Agathocles ends up on the wrong side of his analysis. Controlled vulnerability. The third transcript calls it a law, and it is, but it is also the clearest illustration of the line between genuine surface management and the corrosive deception that Agathocles practiced. The fully armored person, the one who never shows a crack, who projects total competence in every direction simultaneously, who offers nothing that could be read as human weakness, does not create trust. They create envy. They create the specific, itching desire in others to find the flaw, to expose the gap, to prove that the invulnerability is a performance. True surface management, the Machiavellian kind, done correctly, includes the deliberate, controlled display of small, genuine vulnerabilities. Not your strategic weaknesses, not the places where you can actually be hurt. The human texture, the admission that you are bad at something inconsequential. The slightly embarrassing story from your past that makes you recognizable rather than intimidating. The small, authentic imperfection that tells the room, I am real. I am not a monument. This is not weakness. This is the Ben Franklin effect in action. When people help you or see a flaw in you, they lower their guard. They feel a sense of connection. They stop looking for what you're hiding because you have given them something that satisfies the search. Never show your throat, but occasionally show a scratch on your arm. The scratch is real. That is what makes it work. Manufactured vulnerability is the thing that fuses the mask to the face. Genuine, selected, proportionate vulnerability is what closes the gap between the surface and the depth in a way that leaves the depth still protected. Stop trying to be understood. This is the practical principle that emerges from everything in this chapter, and it is the one that will save you years of confusion if you are willing to actually apply it. The people who waste years explaining themselves, justifying their decisions, defending their choices, arguing for their worth, are playing the wrong game entirely. They are trying to close the surface depth gap through words, through the declaration of who they are rather than the demonstration of it. And words, in this domain, do almost nothing. Because the people you need to convince are not evaluating your argument. They are watching your behavior over time. They are noting whether what you say aligns with what you do. They are waiting, not impatiently, not consciously, but structurally, to see what you do when it costs you something. When the argument ends and the stakes arrive. When the performance would be easier than the reality, but you choose the reality anyway. That is when the surface and the depth close into one thing. And a person in whom there is no gap between the two has something very rare, something that most people spend their entire lives trying to manufacture with words, while the people who have actually built it say almost nothing at all. When there is no gap between what you project and what you are, you become something genuinely uncommon. A person who cannot be destabilized by exposure because there is nothing to expose. Not a saint, not invulnerable, not without complexity or contradiction or the full range of human difficulty, but honest in the deepest sense, not the sense of saying true things, but the sense of being a true thing, something the world can actually read correctly, something that does not require constant maintenance to hold together. That is the actual Machiavellian prescription, not the mask, the closing of the gap. And now that we have cleared the misreading, now that we have returned Machiavelli to what he was actually saying rather than what his reputation claims, we can walk into the most unsettling of his observations. The one that applies not just to rulers and not just to Florence, but to every human system that has ever existed, including the one you are living inside right now. The cycle that eats everything, even the things you have worked hardest to build. Eyes closed if you can manage it. Think of someone you know who seems genuinely undeniable, not loud, not aggressive, not performing confidence, but simply and completely real in a way that makes argument feel beside the point. Someone whose surface and depth feel like the same thing. You know the quality I mean. You have felt it in a room. Now ask, what is the gap in your own life right now between what you project and what you actually are? Not the embarrassing gap, not the gap you need to confess to anyone, just the one you know is there. Feel the energy cost of maintaining it. Not judgment, just information. The question this chapter leaves you with is not how to close it faster. It is simply, what would it feel like to not need to maintain it at all? Hold that. The next chapter will tell you what happens when you stop. Chapter 4. The cycle that eats everything. Rome did not fall because of barbarians. That is the comfortable story, the external threat, the foreign force, the invasion that no civilization could have withstood. It is comfortable because it locates the cause of collapse safely outside the thing that collapsed. It makes the fall feel like bad luck rather than bad architecture. It means that what happened to Rome could not have been prevented, which means it cannot happen to you. It is also wrong. Machiavelli knew it was wrong. He had read Livy. He had read Polybius. He had sat with the full weight of Roman history, not as mythology, not as inspiration, but as data, and what the data showed was this. By the time the external threats arrived at the gates, the internal rot had already done the work. The external pressure was not the cause of the fall. It was the audit that revealed a collapse already well underway. Rome fell because Romans stopped being Roman. Luxury replaced austerity. Entertainment replaced civic duty. Bread and circuses replaced the disciplines that had built the republic, the specific, practiced willingness to subordinate comfort to the demands of a larger project. The legions that had once been the most formidable military force the ancient world had ever produced became, over generations, dependent on foreign auxiliaries. The Senate that had once been a genuine deliberative body became a theater for the performance of power rather than its exercise. The citizens who had once understood that the republic required their active participation became spectators. The barbarians did not destroy Rome. They walked into a structure that had been quietly destroying itself for 2 centuries. Machiavelli watched the same pattern consume Florence, Venice, Milan, and Naples in his own lifetime, as if the script had been written before the actors were born, as if the outcome were determined not by individual character, but by the logic of a cycle so reliable it might as well be a natural law. He called it the cycle of constitutions. We might simply call it the cycle that eats everything. The pattern is this, and I want you to feel it rather than simply understand it. Strength produces order. A person, or a people, or an institution builds something through genuine effort and genuine sacrifice. The building requires discipline. It requires the willingness to forego the comfortable option in favor of the one that compounds. It requires the specific, practiced ability to act against your own immediate interest in service of something larger and longer. Order produces prosperity. The structure holds. Things work. The effort of the building period begins to pay returns. Life becomes, measurably and genuinely, better. Prosperity produces comfort. This is where the cycle turns. Not dramatically, not with a warning, with the slow, barely perceptible loosening that comes when the pressure that built you is no longer present, and the habits that built you begin to feel unnecessary rather than foundational. Comfort produces weakness. The disciplines erode. Not all at once, gradually, reasonably, one small accommodation at a time, each of which seems justified in isolation. You trained every morning when you were building something. You don't need to train that hard anymore. Things are going well. You read voraciously when you were hungry for the knowledge. You don't need to read as much now. You know enough. You maintained the relationship with intense attention when you weren't sure of it. You don't need that intensity now. It is secure. Each accommodation is individually defensible. Together they produce a person, or an institution, or a civilization that has been insulated from the very conditions that created its capability. And capability that is not regularly tested against real conditions is not maintained. It is lost, slowly, invisibly, until the moment when the conditions change and the test arrives and the capability is needed, and it is simply not there. Weakness invites collapse. The flood comes, and you have no embankments. From the rubble, if enough remains, a new cycle begins. Machiavelli added something to this observation that the Greek historians before him had missed. He identified the engine driving the cycle, and the engine is not external circumstance. It is human nature itself. The same hunger that builds the empire eventually devours it. The same ambition that propels the founder consumes his grandchildren. Not because ambition is a flaw, because ambition, unanchored from the necessity that originally directed it, turns inward. It finds softer targets. It seeks the reward without the discipline that made the reward meaningful. And here is the element that makes this more than historical observation, the element that Machiavelli documented with the cold precision of someone who had watched it happen in real time in the city he loved. The cycle does not announce itself. It never arrives as a recognizable transition. It arrives as a series of small, reasonable decisions, each of which seems, in the moment, like an entirely appropriate response to the actual circumstances. The person living inside the cycle almost never experiences themselves as declining. They experience themselves as having earned the right to relax, as having built enough to coast a little, as having paid the price that entitles them to a dividend. The dividend is the anesthesia. The comfort is the surgery you did not consent to. By the time the incision is visible, the operation has been underway for years. Now bring this lens to your own existence, without mercy, but also without drama. This is not an indictment. It is a diagnostic. Think of the thing you built most carefully, the relationship you fought hardest for, the skill you developed through the most consistent effort, the version of yourself you constructed through the most genuine discipline. Now think about what you did with it once it was built. Did you continue treating it with the intensity that created it? Or did you, reasonably, gradually, invisibly, begin to treat it as a possession rather than a practice? Something you had rather than something you were continuously building? There is a specific feeling that accompanies the turn in the cycle. It feels like arrival, like finally, like the period of striving is over and the period of having has begun. It is one of the most dangerous feelings a human being can experience, not because arrival is bad, but because the feeling of arrival is not a signal that the work is done. It is a signal that the cycle has entered its most treacherous phase. Machiavelli's most counterintuitive prescription, the one that sounds extreme until you understand what it is actually saying, is that conflict is necessary for health. In the Discourses, he made the radical claim that the factional conflict of the Roman Republic, the constant clashing between the Senate and the plebeians, the tension and friction and institutional argument that most observers of his time regarded as a weakness, was not a weakness at all. It was the source of Rome's greatness. The friction kept the system alive. The tension prevented the rot. The ongoing, unresolved pressure of competing interests meant that no single element of the system could settle into the comfortable complacency that is always the beginning of the end. Applied to your life, the implication is this: the struggle you are trying to exit is the very thing keeping you capable. The discomfort you resent is the immune system that prevents decay. The argument you have been avoiding is the conversation that might save the relationship. The discipline that feels unnecessary now that you have arrived is the only thing that will be standing when the cycle turns and arrival reveals itself as the illusion it always was. Comfort is not the reward. Comfort is the anesthesia administered before the surgery you didn't schedule. Here is the neuroscience beneath the philosophy, because Machiavelli's observation was not just political theory. It was a description of something that happens in the brain. When you are building, when the outcome is uncertain, when the challenge is real, when the gap between where you are and where you are trying to go is visible and demanding, your brain is engaged at a fundamentally different level than when you are coasting. The anterior cingulate cortex, which manages cognitive conflict and directs focused attention, operates at high intensity under genuine challenge. Dopaminergic circuits, the reward pathways, function most powerfully not when you receive the reward, but in anticipation of it, in the pursuit of it, in the specific engagement with a difficult and uncertain outcome. When certainty replaces uncertainty, when the outcome is no longer in question, when the challenge has been mastered, when the discipline is no longer required because the position is secure, these systems downregulate. The brain, which is always trying to conserve energy, stops investing heavily in what no longer requires heavy investment. The capability does not disappear immediately. It fades. The edge softens. The reflex is slow. The pattern recognition that was sharp under pressure becomes approximate under comfort. And the person living inside this process does not experience themselves as losing capability. They experience themselves as having earned the right to use less of it. This is the neurological mechanism of the cycle. This is how Rome became soft without any Roman deciding to become soft. This is how every relationship, every institution, every personal discipline enters its decline, not through a decision to decline, but through the accumulation of individually reasonable decisions to relax. So what do you do with this? Machiavelli's answer was not to artificially manufacture hardship, not to reject prosperity or refuse comfort or treat every moment of ease with suspicion. His answer was structural. You build systems that preserve the necessary friction. You maintain the practice that the position no longer requires. You treat the discipline not as a means to an end, something you do until you arrive, but as the architecture of the self. The thing you do because without it you are not the person who built what you have. You are only the person who lives inside it. You choose your conflicts deliberately. The argument you have been avoiding because the relationship feels stable enough. Have it, carefully, because a relationship that cannot absorb honest tension is not stable. It is merely undisturbed. The skill you have stopped practicing because your current level is sufficient, continue practicing it, because sufficiency today is obsolescence in a cycle that does not pause for the satisfied. And above all, you watch for the feeling of arrival, not to resist it or refuse it, to note it, to say to yourself, with the specific alertness of someone who has read this far, this feeling is the signal. The cycle has turned. The question is not whether I have arrived. The question is what I am building from here. There is one more element of the cycle that Machiavelli documented, and it is the one most relevant to the interior of a life rather than the exterior of an empire. He observed that the greatest leaders, the sharpest minds, the most formidable strategists in history were almost universally forged in deprivation rather than privilege. Not because suffering is inherently ennobling. It is not. Suffering without meaning produces bitterness, not capability. But because necessity, real necessity, the kind that strips away every option except the essential ones, forces the development of faculties that comfort never demands. The person who has always had enough never fully develops the capacity to function without it. The person who has never had enough develops that capacity through no choice of their own. Necessity is the great sculptor, indifferent, brutal, and extraordinarily precise. It removes everything that is not load-bearing and leaves only what is. This is why Machiavelli wrote, in the Discourses, that it may sometimes be the highest wisdom to simulate folly. Not because foolishness is a strategy, but because when the world underestimates you, when people write you off, when the pressure to perform is removed, you are given something that cannot be purchased: time. Time to build without interference. Time to observe without being observed. Time to develop without the distorting pressure of other people's expectations. He lived this for 14 years in Sant'Andrea. Written off, irrelevant, forgotten, and in that invisibility, in the specific, fertile obscurity of a man who was no longer important enough to watch, he built the most enduring body of political thought in Western history. The cycle tried to eat him. He used the descent as the laboratory. That is the move. Not to fight the cycle, you cannot fight a natural law, but to understand exactly where you are inside it at any given moment, and to respond not with the emotion the position provokes, but with the intelligence the position requires. When you are ascending, build the embankments. Do not let prosperity convince you the flood is over. When you are in comfort, maintain the discipline. Treat it as architecture, not achievement. When the cycle turns and the descent begins, do not mistake it for failure. Recognize it as the forge. Necessity has arrived. The sculptor has picked up the chisel. What it removes was always going to be removed. What it leaves is what you actually are. Sit with this for a moment. Somewhere in your life right now, in your work, your relationships, your physical self, your intellectual engagement with the world, somewhere, the cycle has turned and you already know it. You have been aware of it the way you are aware of a sound in a room you have been pretending not to hear. I am not asking you to fix it right now. I am asking you to name it, privately, without judgment, without the story about why it is justified or temporary or different from what it actually is. Just name it, and then notice what becomes possible the moment you stop pretending you don't hear it. The next chapter gives you the operating system for exactly this. 9 laws drawn from everything we have built together so far, each one a precision instrument for a specific situation you have already encountered and will encounter again. Not advice. Architecture. Chapter 5. The 9 laws. Everything we have built together so far, the mechanics of self-interest, the architecture of virtue, the misreading that buried Machiavelli's actual argument, the cycle that consumes everything it builds, all of it has been preparation for this. Not because the previous chapters were preamble. They were not. They were the foundation. And a foundation without a structure built on it is just an expensive hole in the ground. This chapter is the structure. 9 laws. Not rules, laws. The distinction matters. Rules are imposed from outside and can be broken without consequence if no one is watching. Laws operate whether you acknowledge them or not, whether you agree with them or not, whether you have been told about them or not. Gravity is a law. Self-interest is a law. The cycle is a law. These 9 principles are laws in the same sense. Descriptions of how human social reality actually operates, drawn from Machiavelli's 5 centuries of accumulated relevance and the behavioral science that has spent the last 50 years independently arriving at the same conclusions. You have been living inside these laws your entire life. The only question is whether you have been living inside them consciously, building with them, accounting for them, using them as instruments, or unconsciously, which means they have been using you. The first law, selective silence. Most people talk to fill the void. Not because they have something to say, because silence is uncomfortable, because in silence, there is nothing between them and their own thoughts, and their own thoughts have things to tell them they have been successfully avoiding. So they talk. They explain. They overshare. They hand over the blueprint of their mind to anyone who will accept it. And in doing so they become, structurally, predictable. And if you are predictable, you are manageable. Machiavelli understood the information economy of any room before behavioral economists gave it a name. When you speak, you spend. When you listen, you collect. Every sentence you produce tells the room something about what you want, what you fear, what you value, how you think under pressure. Every sentence you withhold is data that remains yours. Think of the last time you felt genuinely unsettled by someone's presence. Was it the person who was loudest? Almost certainly not. It was the person who sat perfectly still, watching, saying almost nothing, whose silence created a vacuum that everyone else in the room rushed to fill, revealing themselves in the rushing. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the most precise form of it. It communicates, I do not need your approval. I am not filling space. I am observing. And the person who is observing while everyone else is performing has an information advantage that no amount of verbal cleverness can match. The practical application is simpler and harder than it sounds. Stop explaining yourself. Stop defending your decisions to people who did not ask and would not be changed by the explanation. Stop announcing your plans before they are real. Stop seeking validation for effort not yet made. Because the brain's partial satisfaction of desire through social acknowledgement is exactly what releases the pressure that should have been driving the actual work. Build in the dark. Let the results speak. Their voice will be louder than anything you could have said, and it will be heard by people whose attention is worth having. The second law, strategic amorality. This is the law where you will feel the most resistance. And the resistance is worth examining, because the resistance itself is part of what this law is describing. You have been trained, since childhood, to evaluate the world through a binary lens. Good and bad, fair and unfair, right and wrong. This moral framework is not without value. It is the architecture of a functioning society and the foundation of genuine relationships. I am not asking you to abandon it. I am asking you to notice when you are using it as a substitute for thinking. Because here is what happens when the moral framework becomes the primary lens for every situation. You spend enormous amounts of energy being offended, being wounded, being indignant about the behavior of a world that does not share your framework and will not adjust to accommodate it. Someone betrays you. You spend weeks processing the injustice of it rather than analyzing why it happened, what it tells you about the structure you were operating in, and what the information enables you to do next. You lose an opportunity. You focus on the unfairness of the loss rather than the intelligence available in the pattern. The Machiavellian mind does not deal in good or bad. It deals in effective or ineffective. When a mechanic opens the hood of a car that won't start, she does not call the engine evil. She finds the broken part and fixes it or replaces it. The engine is not a moral entity. It is a system. Her job is to understand it well enough to make it work. When someone attacks you, offense is the luxury of someone who can afford to spend energy on performance rather than analysis. The useful questions are not why did they do this to me, but what do they want? What is their leverage? What does this move make available to me? And what is the most effective response given the actual situation rather than the situation I wish I were in? Strategic amorality does not mean you have no ethics. It means your ethics do not blind you to the mechanics of what is actually happening. You can be a genuinely good person and a cold strategist simultaneously. The coldness is not character, it is mode. It is the specific gear you engage when the situation requires analysis rather than feeling. A good person with no capacity for strategic thought is not more virtuous than one who has developed both. They are simply less capable of defending what they value. Stop asking why did this happen to me? Start asking what does this make possible? The third law, controlled vulnerability. The person who appears perfectly armored does not inspire trust. They inspire envy. And envy, at sufficient intensity, becomes the desire to find the crack, to prove that the invulnerability is a performance, to expose the gap between the surface and the depth. Machiavelli's prescription here is counterintuitive and precise. Give them a flaw, a small one, a real one, something genuine and human and inconsequential. The admission that you are bad at something that doesn't matter, the slightly embarrassing story from a moment that no longer has teeth, the small and authentic imperfection that tells the room you are a real person rather than a monument. This is what the third transcript calls the Ben Franklin effect, and the psychological mechanism is as well documented as it is underused. When people see a flaw in you, they lower their guard. They feel a sense of connection, something like, he is human. He is like me. And in that moment of connection, The scanning for larger, more threatening flaws stops. They have found what they were looking for. The search is complete. What they don't know, what you have not told them, is that the flaw they found was selected. It was the one you chose to give them. The actual vulnerabilities, the strategic weaknesses, the places where you can genuinely be reached, those remain locked behind a door they are now too comfortable to look for. Never show your throat, but occasionally show a scratch on your arm. The scratch is real. That is not a small detail. Manufactured vulnerability is immediately detectable by anyone paying attention. It has the specific hollowness of a performance, and it produces the opposite of its intended effect. Genuine, selected, proportionate vulnerability closes the surface depth gap in a way that leaves you protected where protection matters. The goal, always, is to be undeniable rather than understood. But being undeniable does not mean being impenetrable. It means being real enough that exposure carries no threat, because what can be seen is what you actually are, and what you actually are is not something that can be used against you. The fourth law, the mirror. Everyone is the protagonist of their own story. This is not a flaw. It is the structure of consciousness. Every person you encounter is, from their own perspective, at the center of the narrative. Everyone else, including you, is a supporting character. The mistake most people make is trying to insert themselves into that narrative as a competing protagonist, trying to be impressive, trying to be the most interesting person in the room, trying to redirect the story toward themselves. Dark intelligence. And here the third transcript uses a term I want to preserve because it captures something precise, recognizes that you do not win by outshining people. You win by becoming the surface on which they see themselves most clearly. Reflect their emotions back. Match their energy. Use their language. Adopt the register they are operating in. When you mirror someone well, something psychologically specific happens. They do not see you. They see a version of themselves. And because they are oriented toward themselves, they experience you as the most perceptive, the most aligned, the most trustworthy person they have encountered in some time, even if you have said almost nothing. But here is the Machiavellian purpose beneath the social technique, and it is what separates this from mere manipulation. When you are mirroring, you are not performing. You are observing. You are in the most information-rich position available in any social interaction, the position of someone who is receiving rather than transmitting. You are learning what this person values, fears, responds to, needs. You are mapping the architecture of their psychology while they are busy enjoying the experience of being understood. The mirror has no ego. It simply reflects. And the person who can suspend their ego long enough to become the mirror, genuinely, not as a technique, but as a practice, has access to more accurate information about the people around them than anyone who has been too busy talking to listen. The fifth law, outcome independence. The root of almost every form of interpersonal weakness is attachment to a specific outcome with a specific person or institution. You want the job, the relationship, the respect, the recognition, and because you want it with the specific intensity of someone who has decided that this particular outcome is necessary, you signal it. In your posture, your tone, the slight desperation that lives just beneath the surface of your most carefully composed requests. And desperation, in the laws of power, is repulsive. Not morally repulsive, structurally repulsive. People are drawn to those who can live without them and uncomfortable around those who cannot. This is not cruelty. It is the same structural logic as everything else in this book. The person who needs nothing has leveraged the person who needs something can never manufacture. Machiavelli understood that fear of loss makes you a slave. If your employer knows you are terrified of losing the position owns you. If your partner knows you are terrified of being alone, the relationship owns you. The negotiation you cannot walk away from is the negotiation you have already lost. The prescription is specific and demanding. Mentally accept the worst-case scenario. Visualize the loss, the actual loss, in detail, without the story that makes it more or less than it is. And then ask honestly, would I survive this? In almost every case, the answer is yes. You would survive. It would hurt, perhaps significantly, and you would survive. The moment you have genuinely made peace with the worst case, not performed peace with it, but actually arrived at a place where you understand you would survive and continue, you become something different in every room you enter. You can speak the truth because you are no longer protecting an outcome. You can take risks because the fall no longer controls you. You can walk away from the table with real leverage precisely because walking away is not a bluff. Outcome independence is not indifference. You can want something with genuine intensity and still be willing to lose it. The wanting does not compromise you. The inability to function without the specific outcome does. Separate them. Want fully. Need nothing. The sixth law, the useful enemy. Most people want to be liked by everyone. They manage their behavior to minimize conflict, smooth friction, maintain the broadest possible social warmth. This is understandable. It is also, at sufficient intensity, a form of atrophy. Machiavelli advised the prince not only to be prepared for conflict, but to actively study it. Because conflict, real conflict, with a real opponent who is trying to defeat you, is the only reliable external source of accurate information about your actual capabilities. Not the capabilities you believe you have, the ones that hold under genuine pressure. Without resistance, the mind softens. The reflexes slow. The pattern recognition that developed under pressure becomes approximate in its absence. You think you are still sharp because no one has tested you recently. And then something tests you, and you discover that the sharpness was a memory rather than a current reality. An enemy sharpens you. An enemy forces you to focus in ways that comfort never demands. An enemy reveals the weaknesses you have been successfully ignoring, the gaps in your preparation, the blind spots in your thinking, the places where your confidence has outpaced your capability. This does not mean you should manufacture conflict or invite hostility. It means you should stop running from the friction that already exists. The competitor who is trying to take what you have built. The critic whose objections contain, beneath the hostility, a genuine diagnostic. The relationship that keeps producing the same argument, which means it keeps producing the same information about something unresolved. Let their pressure sharpen you. Let their doubt be the evidence of your ambition. Let the war, if war is what it is, elevate the standard of what you are required to be. Tesla needed Edison. Ollie needed Fraser. The friction creates the fire. And there is one more dimension here that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately. Nothing unites people faster than a common threat. If you are trying to build something collective, a team, a family, a movement, the most powerful cohesive force available is not shared values or shared vision. It is a shared adversary. Not manufactured, not cynical, real. The thing that is actually threatening what you are all building together. Name it. Let it do the work that inspiration alone cannot sustain. The seventh law, the persona. You believe you are one person, consistent, unified, authentic, the same self in every context, readable, what you see is what you get. This belief feels like integrity. It is also a limitation that is costing you more than you know. You are, in fact, a multiplicity. You are measurably different with your parents than with your closest friend. Different in the room where you feel safe than in the room where you feel threatened. Different when you are being evaluated than when you are at ease. This is not hypocrisy. It is the natural fluidity of a social animal navigating environments with different demands. The Machiavellian insight is this. Most people experience this multiplicity unconsciously, reactively, without awareness or intention. They are different in different contexts because the contexts pull them in different directions, and they call whatever emerges in each context their authentic self, which means they have no authentic self, only a collection of conditioned responses to stimuli. The person who has consciously curated their personas, who understands what each situation requires and can meet it with the appropriate version of themselves, is not less authentic than the person who is not. They are more so, because they have done the harder work of understanding what they actually are beneath all the reactions, and they are choosing, deliberately, how to show up rather than being pulled into a response they didn't select. Machiavelli's lion and fox. The ferocious capacity to confront what must be confronted. The cunning capacity to navigate what cannot be confronted directly. If you are only the lion, you walk into every trap that cunning can construct. If you are only the fox, every situation that requires force will consume you. The capacity to be both, to choose which the situation requires and meet it fully, is not inconsistency. It is the most sophisticated form of integrity available. Be water. Take the shape of the container. When the container breaks, flow. Do not shatter. The eighth law, necessary suspicion. Trust but verify. You have heard this. It is too soft. Verify, then trust provisionally, with full awareness that provisional trust is a structure under ongoing inspection rather than a commitment made once and never revisited. The naive mind projects its own goodness onto the world. I would not lie to them, therefore they will not lie to me. I would not betray this, therefore it will not be betrayed. This projection, this assumption of shared framework, shared values, shared behavioral standards, is the cause of the most expensive mistakes most people ever make. Not because the people around them are villains, because projecting your own internal standards onto others who have different ones is a category error that produces results you should have seen coming. Machiavelli wrote, "Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that he who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived." Do not be the one who allows themselves to be deceived. The instrument here is not paranoia. Paranoia is fear without evidence, and it is exhausting and corrosive and counterproductive. The instrument is attention to detail. Watch what people do, not what they say. Words are easy. Words are designed, often, to manage your perception rather than to inform it. Actions are the only reliable data. Patterns of behavior over time are the only reliable truth. When someone offers you a significant opportunity, ask what is in it for them, not with suspicion, with curiosity. When someone compliments you excessively, ask what they are trying to distract you from. When someone tells you what you want to hear with remarkable consistency, ask whether they are responding to you or managing you. Give people small amounts of trust and observe how they use it before you extend more. It is better to be pleasantly surprised by loyalty than devastated by a betrayal you had the information to anticipate. Necessary suspicion is not the enemy of genuine relationship. It is the quality control that makes genuine relationship possible, because relationships built on the assumption of goodness rather than the evidence of it are not genuine relationships. They are comfortable illusions that carry the specific, expensive fragility of everything built on sand. The ninth law, the shadow. We end here, at the deepest law, and I want you to stay with it longer than the others. Carl Jung called it the shadow. The repository of everything you have been told or have decided is unacceptable about yourself. The anger, the hunger for power, the capacity for cruelty, the desire to dominate, to win at cost, to prioritize yourself over others in ways that conflict with the identity you have constructed and the image you maintain. Society teaches you to repress these things, to be harmless, to be nice, to perform the absence of darkness so consistently that you eventually come to believe the performance is the reality. Machiavelli, 5 centuries before Jung, arrived at the same essential insight from a different direction. A harmless man is not a virtuous man. A harmless man is simply a weak man who has decided to call his weakness by a more flattering name. Here is why this matters practically. The person who does not know their own capacity for darkness cannot recognize it in others. They will be repeatedly blindsided by the behavior of people who are operating from exactly the shadow the observer has refused to acknowledge in themselves. They will call it evil. They will call it incomprehensible. What it actually is familiar. It is exactly what they would do if they stopped pretending they would not. And worse, the repressed shadow does not disappear. It goes underground. It finds expression in passive aggression, in resentment that accumulates without being named, in self-sabotage at the exact moments when life most demands clarity and force. The darkness you will not face in the light controls you from the dark. The instruction is not to become cruel. It is to know that you could be, To look at the capacity directly, to say, with genuine acknowledgement rather than horror, I see you, I understand what you are, and I choose how you are used. Because here is the truth that the ninth law is protecting. The most genuinely powerful people, the ones whose authority comes from something real rather than from the management of appearances, are not people who have no darkness. They are people who have integrated it, who know what they are capable of and have made a conscious, ongoing choice about how that capability is directed. When you know you could destroy something and you choose not to, that is virtue. Real virtue. Not the absence of capacity, but the deliberate governance of it. That is what Machiavelli meant by the prince who can be both lion and fox. Not the person who has only the gentle options available. The person who has the full range available and governs the selection. Peaceful by choice, not peaceful by inability. Integrate the monster. It is not your enemy. It is the part of your power you have been leaving on the floor. Take a breath here. 9 laws. Each one a lens. Each one, if you are honest, something you have already witnessed operating in your own life. Usually in the moment after a mistake that one of these laws would have prevented. I am not asking you to apply all 9 immediately. I am asking you to carry them the way you carry a set of tools you now know exist. The situation will arise. The law will be relevant. And you will have a choice you did not have before, not because the situation is different, but because you are. One chapter remains before the conclusion. It is the most personal one, the one that brings everything back to a single farmhouse, a single man, and the specific, irreversible decision that made him worth 5 centuries of conversation. It is the chapter about what you do when the cycle has taken everything, and the only thing left is what you were always made of. Chapter 6. The Death and the Robes. There is a version of you that you have not yet met. Not the version built from ambition or performance or the careful management of other people's perceptions. Not the version assembled from the expectations of the people who came before you or the identity you constructed to survive circumstances you were too young to choose. A different version. One that exists not in the future as something to become, but beneath the present as something to uncover. Machiavelli found this version of himself in the worst year of his life. And I want to stay in that farmhouse longer than we have before, because this is not a story about resilience, and it is not a motivational fable about the man who kept going when things got hard. It is something more specific and more useful and more honest than either of those things. It is a story about what happens when everything that was not essential has been removed, and what remains. December 1513. 14 months since the arrest. 14 months since the strappado. 14 months of the farm, the firewood merchants, the card games with the butcher and the miller, the slow specific indignity of irrelevance in a city that used to require his presence. He is not recovering. Recovery implies a return to what was before. What was before is gone. The title, the salary, the access, the sense of being someone the world needed. None of it is coming back, and on some level, he already knows it. The letters he sends to former colleagues are met with polite silence or careful distance. The political machinery of Florence has moved on and closed around the space he occupied as if he had never been there. He is 44 years old, in debt, physically marked by torture, and by every external measure finished. This is the point in most stories where the protagonist makes a decision. A dramatic decision. A visible turning point with a clear before and after. A moment you could score with music. What Machiavelli did was quieter than that, and more radical. He chose, every single evening, to dress for the encounter. Not because anyone was watching. Not because the robes would change anything about the farm or the debt or the silence from Florence. Not because the discipline of the ritual would be rewarded or recognized, or even known. He dressed for the encounter because the alternative, to let the mud stay, to let the afternoon's humiliations define the evening's posture, to become, gradually and invisibly, the man the circumstances seemed to be making him, was a form of death he refused to consent to. The old self, the secretary of the Florentine Republic, the man who sat across from Cesare Borgia and did not flinch, The diplomat who commanded the respect of kings, that self was gone. It was not coming back. The conditions that had produced it no longer existed. And rather than spending whatever remained of his life mourning the version that had been taken, he buried it with full awareness and asked what was left. What was left was this, a mind. The specific, extraordinary mind that had spent 25 years observing power operate in the most sophisticated political environment in the Western world. A mind that had absorbed Livy and Polybius and Thucydides and Caesar and translated the whole of it through the lens of direct, personal, painful experience with how human beings actually behave when the conditions change. A mind that no one could dislocate, that no amount of torture or exile or financial ruin could actually reach. The death of the old self is not a metaphor. It is the specific, necessary, and irreversible process of letting go of the version of you that was built for conditions that no longer exist, so that what actually remains can be seen clearly, without the distortion of what you wish were still true. Most people never do this willingly. They hold on. They maintain the story that the previous version is still operational, still relevant, still the primary self, even as the conditions that made it real recede further and further into the past. They spend years, sometimes decades, performing a version of themselves that the world has already moved on from, wondering why the performance no longer produces the results it once did. The performance fails because it is a performance, and a performance of a self that no longer exists is not even good theater. It is the specific exhaustion of someone who has confused maintenance with living. Machiavelli let the old self die, and in the silence left by its death, something was created that the living version never could have produced. There is a passage from the second transcript that lands here with full force. It describes discipline as an act of violence against your own weakness. I want to reframe that, because the word violence carries the wrong texture for what this chapter is actually describing. The act Machiavelli performed every evening was not violence against himself. It was precision, the deliberate, practiced refusal to let the external circumstances of a given day determine the internal posture of the evening. The recognition that the farm was real, the debt was real, the silence from Florence was real, and that none of it was the totality of what he was. This is what the second transcript is actually pointing at beneath the aggressive language. The man who works harder when he is miserable, who focuses deeper when he is heartbroken, who does not cancel the mission because of rain. This is not emotional suppression. It is emotional governance. The Machiavellian principle that you are the prince and your emotions are the subjects. You listen to them. You do not allow them to rule the kingdom. And here is the neuroscience that validates what Machiavelli practiced by instinct. When you act in direct opposition to how you feel, when you choose the regal robes despite the mud, when you begin the work despite the fatigue, when you maintain the discipline despite the absence of reward, you are doing something specific to your neural architecture. You are building the gap between stimulus and response. You are developing the capacity, measurable, trainable, physiologically real, to choose your behavior rather than be determined by your state. Each time you override the impulse that the situation produces, the circuit that enables the override becomes stronger. Each time you dress for the encounter when the day says not to, you are not performing discipline. You are constructing it, neurologically, in the specific way that all genuine construction works, incrementally, invisibly, through the accumulation of actions that seem small in isolation and become irreversible in aggregate. This is what Machiavelli was doing in that study. Not recovering, not coping, building. The death of the old self has a cost. Let's not pretend otherwise. You may lose friendships, not because the people are bad, but because the version of you they were attached to is no longer the version you are living as. People who knew you in a previous chapter sometimes cannot make the crossing to the new one, not from malice, because every relationship contains an implicit contract about who each person is, and when one person changes the terms of that contract, genuinely, not temporarily, the relationship must renegotiate or dissolve. You may be misread. The distance that comes from genuine interior change is often perceived by people who have not changed as coldness or arrogance, or the specific contempt of someone who thinks they have become better than others. Let this misreading stand without correction. Correction requires the expenditure of the very energy you are redirecting into construction. And the people who will eventually understand the change will understand it through evidence, not explanation. You may lose the version of your life that was built for the previous version of yourself, the career that suited who you were, the relationships organized around who you used to need, the habits that serve the person you are no longer building. This loss is real. It requires genuine mourning, not performed stoicism. Grief is not weakness. Grief is the honest acknowledgement that something real has ended. You are allowed to feel it entirely. What you are not allowed to do, what Machiavelli did not do, in that farmhouse, in that specific darkness, is let the grief become the final story. Let it be a chapter. Let it end. And then dress for the encounter. The central paradox of this entire book announces itself most clearly here, in this chapter, at this moment. The man who fully accepts that life is not fair is the only one capable of building a life that lasts. The first time you heard that sentence, it sounded like the conclusion of a bitter argument with the world. It sounded like giving up, like the resignation of someone who has stopped expecting better. But here, with everything we have built together, with Fortuna and Virtue and the cycle and the 9 laws and Sforza's hands and Agathocles' paranoid sleeplessness and the Florence that turned on the Medici in hours after 60 years of patronage, here, that sentence sounds different. It sounds like the beginning of something. Because the person who has accepted the unfairness of the world has stopped spending Virtue on the argument that it should be different. They have stopped waiting for the conditions to improve before they begin living with full force. They have stopped building on the sand of what they believe they are owed and started building on the only foundation that actually holds, the internal architecture that remains after everything external has been stripped away. Machiavelli did not wait for Florence to invite him back. He created something Florence could not ignore. He did not wait for recognition, for rehabilitation, for the world to correct its mistake and restore what had been taken. He worked in the dark, for an audience he would never meet, building something whose value was entirely independent of whether the world in which he was building it would ever acknowledge it. He died in 1527, poor and largely forgotten. The Prince was published 5 years after his death. The discourses later still. He planted seeds in a field he would never harvest. And 5 centuries later, here you are, still receiving them. The second transcript asks, do you want the warmth of the herd or the power of the hunt? And frames it as a choice between comfort and freedom, between belonging and capability. I want to offer a reframe. Because the binary is false, and the false binary is where the question loses its force. The real choice is not between warmth and power. It is between the warmth of conditions that have not been tested and the deeper warmth of a life built on what is actually real about you. Between belonging to a version of yourself that was assembled by circumstance and belonging to the version that was revealed by necessity. Between the comfort of the performance and the specific, quiet confidence of someone who knows, from the inside, what they are made of. Machiavelli did not choose the cold path. He chose the honest one. And the honest one happened to be cold, because honesty, when the conditions of your life are genuinely difficult, does not come with central heating. But he was not alone in that study. He had Livy. He had Thucydides. He had the ancients who received him with affection and fed him the food he was born for. He had the work itself, which is always, for the person who has found the work they were built for, its own form of warmth. Your discipline is not your prison. It is your fortress. They can take the title, the income, the social position, the applause. They cannot take the internal architecture. They cannot take the ability to dress for the encounter even when the day has been humiliating. They cannot take what was built in the dark, in the silence, in the years when no one was watching and you chose to build anyway. That alone is yours. Before the conclusion, I want you to sit with something specific. Think of a version of yourself that has ended, a chapter that is genuinely closed. Not the one you are maintaining out of habit or fear, but one you know, honestly, is over. A role that no longer fits. A story about who you are that the evidence of your own life has been quietly disconfirming for some time. Just identify it. Don't dramatize it. Don't mourn it yet. Just see it clearly. The way you can see something clearly when you stop pretending it is still what it was. And then notice what is left when that version is removed from the frame. Not emptiness. Something quieter than emptiness. Something that was always there, beneath the performance, waiting with the specific patience of something that knows it does not need to announce itself. That is what the conclusion is about. Not what you have learned, what you have always been, and what becomes possible the moment you stop asking the world for permission to be it. Conclusion. The river doesn't hate you. The man who fully accepts that life is not fair is the only one capable of building a life that lasts. You have heard that sentence before. You heard it at the very beginning, before any of this had been built, before the farmhouse and the torture and the regal robes and the flood and the 9 laws and the death of the old self. You heard it when it sounded like a hard thing, like a door closing rather than one opening. Sit with it now. Notice what it does in the body this time. Notice whether it lands differently. Not because the sentence has changed. It hasn't. Not a word. But because you have. You have been changed by what you agreed to when you kept going. And something that sounds like defeat at the beginning of a journey sounds, at the end of it, remarkably like the ground becoming solid beneath your feet. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. The river doesn't hate you. I want to stay with that for a moment, because it is the most important sentence in this book and also the simplest one, and simple sentences earn their place by surviving contact with complexity rather than avoiding it. Fortuna, the flood, the indifferent torrent, the half of life you cannot govern, does not hate you. It does not target you. It does not arrive at your door because you failed to deserve better or because the universe has a position on your suffering. The river rises because rivers rise. The flood comes because floods come. And the ground gives way beneath the people who built on sand not because they were punished for it, but because sand does not hold weight. There is a specific freedom in this that is not available inside the story of a world that owes you fairness. Because in that story, every loss is an injustice. Every setback is a verdict. Every difficult circumstance is evidence that something has gone wrong that should have gone right. And you spend the whole of your virtue, the finite, precious, irreplaceable capacity to act on what is actually available to you, on the argument. The argument with the river, which the river will never hear, which the river will never answer, which produces nothing except the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a force that was never fighting them. The river doesn't hate you. It simply moves. Build accordingly. You have spent several hours inside a framework that 5 centuries of careful misreading turned into a reputation for cynicism and manipulation. I want to name what you actually encountered. You encountered a man who watched Florence collapse from inside it at 25 and extracted structural principles from the wreckage rather than bitterness. You encountered Sforza, a peasant's son who made himself a duke not by being given anything but by building, in silence, with total discipline, for 2 decades, until the moment Fortuna opened a crack, and he was precisely ready for it. You encountered Agathocles, who won everything and governed nothing, and whose life is the most useful warning in this entire book. The warning that the means you use to build a thing determine the kind of thing you build, and that a structure erected on sustained deception requires more energy to maintain than it will ever produce. You encountered the cycle, the iron rhythm that does not pause for the deserving, that does not exempt the disciplined, that does not reward arrival with permanence. And you encountered the only honest response to it, not the fantasy of escaping the cycle, but the specific, practiced intelligence of someone who knows exactly where they are inside it at any given moment and responds accordingly. You encountered 9 laws that were operating in your life before you had names for them. You have names for them now. Names are not small things. A force you can name is a force you can work with rather than simply be moved by. And you encountered the interior of a farmhouse in Sant'Andrea, and a man who dressed in regal robes every evening not because anyone was watching, but because he had decided, in the specific silence of genuine necessity, that the version of himself being made by the circumstances was not the only version available. Let me speak to you now not as a narrator delivering a framework, but as someone who has sat with this material long enough to be changed by it. What Machiavelli was doing in that study was not strategy. It was not the cold calculation of a man plotting his return to power. It was something quieter and more essential than that. It was the refusal to outsource the definition of himself to the conditions around him. The conditions said, "You are finished." The conditions said, "You are irrelevant, disgraced, forgotten." A man arguing with firewood merchants about pennies while the city you served moves forward without looking back. And he looked at those conditions with the full, clear-eyed accuracy he had spent his entire life developing. The accuracy of perception that he argued was the rarest and most essential human capability. And he said, "Yes, all of that is true, and none of it is the totality of what I am." That is virtue in its most complete form. Not the virtue of the battlefield or the negotiating table or the political arena. The virtue of the self that remains when everything the world provided has been taken back. The virtue that does not require favorable conditions to operate. The virtue that dresses for the encounter even when there is no audience, even when there is no applause, even when the food he was born for is the only nourishment available, and it will have to be enough. It was enough. 5 centuries of conversations say it was enough. Here is the last thing the core vocabulary asks of you before you carry it forward. Virtue. You understand now that this is not a quality you either have or don't have. It is a practice. It is the repeated, deliberate choice to act with full force on what is actually available, even when, especially when, what is available seems insufficient. You build it the way Machiavelli built it, the way Sforza built it, in the dark, without applause, through the accumulation of actions that seem small in isolation and become irreversible in aggregate. Fortuna, you understand now that she is not your adversary. She is the test of whether what you built was built for the actual conditions or only for the comfortable ones. She is the audit, and the audit is not your enemy. It is the only honest feedback the world will ever give you about the quality of your construction. Necessita, you understand now that the difficulty you are in, or the difficulty you are moving toward, is not a detour from the real work. It is the real work. The sculptor has arrived. What it removes was always going to be removed. What it leaves is what you actually are. The cycle. You understand now that the feeling of arrival is a signal, not a destination. That comfort is not the reward. It is the phase of the cycle that precedes the test. Build the embankments. Maintain the discipline. Treat the practice as architecture, not achievement. The surface and the depth. You understand now that the goal was never the performance. The goal was always the closing of the gap, the becoming of something so genuinely real that exposure carries no threat, because what can be seen is what you actually are, and what you actually are is not something that can be used against you. These are not ideas anymore. They are yours. You have earned them the way you earn anything that lasts, by staying with them past the point where the easy understanding ends and the difficult one begins. I want to return to that letter one final time. December 10th, 1513. A 44-year-old man at a desk in a failing farmhouse, writing to the only friend who is still writing back. He has described the mud and the card games and the firewood merchants and the specific smallness of the days. And then he describes the evenings, the robes, the courts of ancient men, the food he was born for. He does not know, as he writes this, that the words will survive him. He does not know that the book he is building in that study will be published 5 years after his death and read 5 centuries after that. He does not know that the people who tortured him and exiled him and stripped him of everything will be forgotten while he endures. He knows only this: the evening is here. The robes are waiting. The ancient courts are open to him. And the work that is entirely his, that no circumstance has been able to take, that belongs to him in a way that the title and the salary and the recognition never did. The work is there. So he sits down, and he begins. That is the invitation this book has been building toward from its first sentence. not a strategy, not a system, not a set of techniques for the management of other people's perceptions or the optimization of your positioning and hierarchies that were not built for you. An invitation to sit down and begin. Not when the conditions improve, not when the recognition arrives, not when the version of yourself that was taken by circumstances you didn't choose has been restored and the world has corrected its mistake and invited you back to the table. Now, in the mud, with whatever is left, with the internal architecture that has been growing beneath everything that was taken, that was always growing, that necessity has been building without your permission, that has been waiting with the patience of something that knows it does not need to announce itself. You are not the person who pressed play on the introduction. That person believed, on some level, that what they were capable of was determined by the conditions around them. That fairness was a prerequisite for full effort. That the world needed to be a certain way before the work could really begin. That person has left the building. What remains, what has been here all along, beneath the performance and the maintenance and the careful management of the gap, is something that requires no favorable conditions. Something that can dress for the encounter in a failing farmhouse. Something that can build in the dark for an audience 5 centuries away and find, in the building itself, the food it was born for. The river doesn't hate you. It never did. Now go build something it cannot wash away. Sit in the silence for a moment, not to reflect on what you have learned. Your mind will do that in its own time, in its own way, at the unexpected moments that understanding always chooses. Just sit. Notice whether something in you is quieter than it was at the beginning, whether the ground feels different under your weight. Whatever you are carrying forward from this, carry it lightly. The heaviest things are always the ones we grip too tightly. What is genuinely yours will stay without gripping. What was never yours will leave without loss. You know the difference now. You have always known the difference. That is what this was always about. Not the learning of new information, but the remembering of something that was true before anyone told you it wasn't. The work continues. It always continues. Go.